You were not your idol. You were something more. You were something less. One day you will fall. You were not your hero. You were something less. You were something more. You ain't gotta stress. You were not your idol. You were not the poster on the wall you used to stare at as a child. You were not the makings of a myth, a future ancient tale to be painted on a dish. You were not a saint. You were not exceptionally good-hearted. You were glass that didn't break. You were not a king. You didn't have a general you can blame when you've forgotten how to win. You were not a genius. You were not some once a generation. Holy fuck, dude, have you seen this? You were not the first and you will not be the last. You were not the errors of your past. You were not a loser. You were not a doctor cause you stare at a computer. You were not your parents or your uncle. Only you determines when you stumble. Stay humble. You were not your idol. You were something more. You were something less. One day you will fall. You were not your hero. You were something less. You were something more. You ain't gotta stress. You were not a big shot. You were not a brand or the epitome of hip-hop. You were not a virtuoso. You were not a sample. You were not a famous logo. You were not a freak. You were not a burden, it just hasn't been your week. You were not a dummy. You were not a disappointment cause you're not a bag of money. You were not the boss. You were not the mayor. You were not the judge while you sitting in his chair. You were not an icon. You were not a fraud. You were not a champ with a room for your rewards. You can just be you and that's okay. Some say better than, but maybe that's another day. For now just keep this in your file. You were not your idol. You were not your idol. You were something more. You were something less. One day you will fall. You were not your hero. You were something less. You were something more. You ain't gotta stress.